The land campaign. The deployment of ground forces for the defence of Malaya consisted of allocation of the 2 Indian divisions from 3 Indian Corps to the defence of northern Malaya, allocation of the equivalent of another division as fortress troops for the defence of Singapore, and allocation of the Australian 8th Division, less 1 brigade, for the defence of southern Malaya in the Johor region. The British Defence Plan, as previously mentioned, allowed for a preemptive move across the northern Malay border into Thailand, Plan Matador. Its intention of denying the Japanese the use of airfields and beaches in southern Thailand was militarily sound, but had 2 major flaws. It required the commander, Air Chief Marshal Brooke Popham, to make a very courageous and potentially career-limiting move by initiating hostilities with both the Thais and the Japanese. And the plan assumed better force levels than were available to the British commanders in Malaya. Soldiers of the 3rd Indian Corps met the initial Japanese assaults. At Kota Baru, this responsibility was allocated to the 9th Indian Division. The 9th Division's troops put up a strong, prepared beach defence which pinned down the Japanese and led to hand-to-hand fighting to clear pillboxes and trenches. Eventually, the Japanese were successful in forcing a breach in the prepared defences. By the end of the first day, the Japanese were at the all-important Kota Baru airfield and were infiltrating between units of the 9th Division. By the 11th of December, 2 days after hostilities started, the 9th Division was forced to withdraw south to Marchang. For the 11th Division, covering the Thai border, the conflict commenced with an attempt to conduct a small-scale Plan Matador. The 11th Division sent 3 separate columns into Thailand about 14 hours after the initial Kota Baru landings. Each column had specific missions to delay the Japanese advance, including by demolitions and destruction. One column, called Crow Column, or Crow Col, was supported by the 2nd, 3rd Australian Motor Transport Company under Major G.A.C. Kiernan. While these operations had some limited success, by the 13th of December all forces had been pushed back to their starting positions. The 11th Division's main defensive position at Chitra was attacked and eventually taken by the Japanese 5th Division at great cost to the 11th Indian Division. It had lost several key commanders and 3 infantry battalions. The divisions of 3 Corps continued a fighting withdrawal down the Malay Peninsula. Between the 30th of December and the 2nd of January, the 11th Division inflicted the heaviest blow to the Japanese forces since the campaign began. Approximately 150 kilometres northwest of Kuala Lumpur, the Japanese were temporarily rebuffed near Kampar. Following ferocious fighting over 4 days, the Japanese 41st Regiment was so badly depleted it could not take part in the subsequent battle for Singapore. However, the Indian 11th Division lacked the reserves to be able to exploit its success. The action had forced the division to merge 2 of its brigades. True to form, the Japanese used flanking manoeuvres to push the division back. Pulling back from Kampar to within 80 kilometres of Kuala Lumpur, the 11th Division, reduced to 2 understrength brigades, sought to hold the Japanese again on their advance line across the Slim River. This action started on the 6th of January 1942, but it did not meet with the same success as that at Kampar. The Japanese uncharacteristically decided to frontally attack supported by tanks. The tank assault cut through the 2 brigades of the 11th Division and into its rear areas, causing the division to scatter. The 11th Division was ordered out of the front line and the decision made to withdraw from central Malaya and hand the defence of southern Malaya to a force based on the Australian 8th Division. This mixed force of Australian, British and Indian units was to be called West Force. Around the 11th of January, the survivors of the 11th Division moved south from Kuala Lumpur and started to pass through the Australian defensive positions held by members of the 8th Division. Kuala Lumpur would not be contested. West Force was deployed with 3 brigades to check what was considered the axis of the Japanese advance and 1 brigade to protect the coastal flank near the Muar River. The brigades covering the Japanese advance included the 27th Australian Brigade and the 8th and 22nd Indian Brigades. These were separated from the flank brigade, the Indian 45th Brigade, by a mountain, Mount Ophir. The withdrawal of British forces south following the Battle of Slim River had been done quickly and in such a way as to encourage the Japanese to advance confidently. This was to lure the Japanese into their first engagement with a battalion of the Australian 27th Brigade, west of Gamas, some 100 kilometres southeast of Kuala Lumpur. The first major Australian engagement was to be in the form of an ambush set up by B Company of the 2nd 30th Battalion. The ambush was designed to allow the advance guard of the Japanese to cross the Gamas Bridge, which, when sufficient Japanese had crossed, was blown. The unsuspecting Japanese caught in the ambush killing zone were mown down. Some 70 Japanese are thought to have been killed in the initial ambush. 6 hours after the ambush, the Japanese had repaired the blown bridge, and some 24 hours of fighting ensued between the 30th Battalion and lead elements of the 5th Division. The 30th Battalion was forced to withdraw, having further increased the losses suffered by the Japanese following the ambush at the Gamas Bridge. Like the action at Kampar, the action at Gamas checked the Japanese advance, but only temporarily. The action near Gamas was part of a wider and final battle for Malaya before the retreat to Singapore. This was called the Battle for Muir. Despite the success near Gamas, the Japanese were to apply intolerable pressure to West forces protecting flank brigade, the 45th Indian Brigade. This pressure was inflicted by the Japanese Guards Division. The 4th Guards Regiment attacked along the coast road towards Muir. Major General Bennett had ordered the forward Indian battalions of the 45th Brigade to deploy astride the river, with some companies on the north and some companies on the south banks. The 4th Guards attacked these isolated companies on the north bank. In the meantime, the 5th Guards Regiment crossed the river upstream and attacked the south bank of the defensive position and moved on to Muir. During the battle, the brigade headquarters was attacked by aircraft, killing most of the staff. The brigade had also lost 2 of its battalion commanders, and the brigade commander himself was concussed. The surviving elements of the 45th Brigade pulled back south to Bakri. The Australian 2nd 29th Battalion was ordered by General Bennett from Sigamat, some 80 kilometres distance, to Bakri to reinforce the British position. The 29th Battalion moved towards the outskirts of Muir, but its movement was hampered by retreating elements of the 45th Brigade. It eventually blocked the gap that had formed. However, during the night, the Japanese moved 5,000 troops and tanks to Muir. The 29th was forced back towards Bakri, where it conducted a spirited defence, including the destruction by anti-tank guns of 9 enemy tanks. General Percival, becoming increasingly concerned about the attack at Muir, ordered the Australian 19th Battalion to Bakri. On the 19th of January, the Japanese Guards pressured the defensive position, now including the 29th and 19th Battalions. The 19th Battalion was ordered to recapture a ridge taken by the Japanese. The counter-attack was done with 3 prongs: a frontal assault, an attack from the right flank, and an attack from the rear. These tactics, very similar to the Japanese own, caused heavy casualties, an estimated 140 Japanese dead. The Guards Division was to exact revenge for this humiliation sometime later by a massacre of British troops at Parat Salong. The following day, the 20th of January, the brigade commander of the 45th Brigade was killed. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Anderson of the 2nd 19th Battalion became the acting brigade commander. There was not a great deal Anderson could do to retrieve the situation. The 45th Brigade had ceased to exist as a formation. The brigade commander and 3 battalion commanders were dead, and the battalions making up the brigades reduced to a shadow of their normal strength and were being encircled. Only 400 Indian and 500 Australian soldiers managed to escape the Japanese encirclement. Under Anderson's leadership, the remainder of the brigade fought its way south through Japanese roadblocks. However, at the Parit Salong Bridge, despite repeated charges, Anderson's force was stopped. Eventually, he ordered his troops to disperse and infiltrate through the blocking Japanese forces to the British forces further south. Those unable to walk were left with volunteer carers north of the Parit Salong Bridge. The 45th Brigade had exacted a heavy toll on the Imperial Guards Division. It had delayed the Guards by a week, destroyed a company of tanks, and reduced the division's strength by a battalion. It had also safeguarded the western flank of General Bennett's West Force. General Yamashita, the commander of the 25th Japanese Army, described the fighting south of Muir as amongst the most savage in the campaign. In revenge, the Guards Division massacred the wounded at Parut Salong. As West Force was pushed south of on the 19th and 20th of January, General Percival directed 3 Corps and West Force to hold a line in central Johor from Mersing on the east coast to Batu Fat on the west coast. This line was chosen to keep Japanese aircraft away from the airfields in southern Malaya. Percival feared that if the Japanese secured these airfields, then convoys coming into Singapore would be placed at greater risk. The line was not chosen because of its tactical value or ease of defence, and this was to show. It was around this time that the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was made aware that Singapore was a naval base, not a citadel like the American citadel of Corregidor in the Philippines. By way of comparison, Singapore is an island 42 kilometres long and 22 kilometres wide, approximately 700 square kilometres in area. It had 2 15-inch naval batteries and an estimated 12 18-pounder batteries for a total of 5 15-inch and 24 18-pounder guns. In other words, 29 significant artillery pieces. All gun emplacements were orientated to defence on the seaward side of the island. Corregidor, by contrast, is 6.5 kilometres long and 2 kilometres wide with an area of 7 square kilometres, less than 1% the land area of Singapore. It had 1 battery of 12-inch naval guns and 23 coastal artillery batteries. This represented some 58 significant guns or heavy mortars, twice the number at Singapore, and they were orientated to protect the whole island, not just one side. Churchill wrote indignantly to his chiefs of staff, "It never occurred to me for a moment that the gorge of the fortress of Singapore, with its splendid moat half a mile to a mile wide, was not entirely fortified against an attack from the northwards. What is the use of having an island for a fortress if it is not made into a citadel?" He went on to write to his chiefs, "How is it that not one of you pointed this out to me at any time when these matters were under discussion? More especially should this have been done because in many various minutes extending over the last 2 years, I have repeatedly shown that I relied upon this defence of Singapore Island against a formal siege, and I have never relied upon the Kra Isthmus plan." The Kra plan was, of course, Plan Matador. This sudden realisation was a catalyst for Churchill to question the utility of continuing to defend Singapore. Just before West Force was ordered to pull back, the 22nd Brigade was still situated in defensive positions near Mersing. The brigade was temporarily assigned a British battalion, the 5th Norfolks, and designated East Force. East Force was assigned the role of protecting the Gemalong Road from the Japanese forces coming down the east coast. Shortly after being given this task, the 5th Norfolks had to be withdrawn to support the deteriorating situation at Muir. About a week later, on the 26th of January, the Japanese amphibious landing at Endau was to occur north of Mersing. As mentioned earlier, this landing was met by RAAF and RAAF aircraft, and also involved HMS Vampire and the soon-to-be-sunk HMS Thanet. The 22nd Brigade was ordered to move from its defensive positions at Mersing about 16 kilometres to the south. It was decided to establish on the Mersing-Gemalong crossroad an ambush. Artillery support was set in place to lay down creeping barrages. During the evening of the assault, Japanese fired random shots to trigger response from the unseen Australians. Eventually, the Japanese contacted a company protecting the east flank of the ambush. About 1 hour later, at 3:30 a.m, the ambush was triggered. Using the creeping barrage as a shield, Australians came onto the rear of the Japanese and inflicted heavy casualties. The fight lasted 5 hours until 8:30 a.m. the next morning. The ambush cost 98 Australian lives, but the Japanese retired back to Mersing and their advance was delayed for 3 days. By the end of January, the ability to hold the Japanese in Johor was in doubt. On the 31st of January, British forces withdrew onto Singapore Island. General Percival's options for defending Singapore were bleak. The focus of the defence effort had been on naval and air defence. There was no meaningful consideration of ground defence and no serious attempt at defensive field works until the major forces evacuated into Singapore. Another cause of concern was not the number of troops, but their training. The depleted units from the Battle of Malaya were reinforced with freshly arrived troops, which in many cases were untrained. The 2nd 29th Battalion, which had been decimated following the Muar battles, was given 500 new replacements, including 19 new officers. The 2nd 19th Battalion also received several hundred new men. The newly arrived 2nd 4th Machine Gun Battalion was well trained, but most of the other reinforcements were not. Most reinforcements had been in the army a matter of weeks. Percival decided to defend the island on the beaches and to hit the Japanese while they were most exposed during a water crossing. In effect, this decision spread his combat forces around the island's 112-kilometre perimeter and left him with a small reserve in the centre of the island. The 8th Australian Division was placed on the northwest coast of the island. The newly arrived 18th Indian Division was considered the most battle-worthy and placed on the northeast coast. Percival considered that the Japanese were most likely to attack the northeast. The other divisions and brigades were placed around the island to provide all-round defence. Percival's strategy left infantry units protecting very large frontages, sometimes in marshy swamps with little ability to move quickly to support a weakened flank or provide supporting fire. General Yamashita, who was running short on ammunition and supplies, paused for only a week before the assault on Singapore. He could not attack Singapore from the sea as he lacked the watercraft which were earmarked for forthcoming operations in Java and Sumatra. Concluding that the northeast of the island was where the naval base was, and therefore likely to have the strongest defences, he chose to attack the northwest, across the Straits of Johor to where the Australians were positioned. On the 9th of February, the Japanese assaulted across the Johor Strait in small craft under cover of darkness. Their objective was to take Kranji village, which would allow them to make repairs to the causeway and bring in more troops. The initial assault fell on the 22nd Brigade, with highly dispersed troops creating blind spots for fire and making it difficult for mutual support between units. It was only a matter of time before the troops of the Japanese 5th and 18th Divisions infiltrated and started to isolate defensive posts. By mid-morning, some troops were seen moving back into the island without leaders or control. The thin defence of the whole island did not allow for a controlled move of troops to fall back defensive positions. In effect, troops were being told to stay in position and fight it out, even if surrounded. There were insufficient reserve troops to provide confidence that an area, once occupied by the Japanese, would be able to be counter-attacked and recovered. In this atmosphere, some commanders started to make decisions on the fly concerning withdrawal and regrouping. Having secured a beachhead, the Japanese pressure on the 22nd Brigade eased for 24 hours while they ferried troops onto the Singapore beachhead. Between the 9th and the 10th, the British sought to reinforce the sector with reserve forces. In the early evening of the 9th, 10th of February, the Guards Division attacked across the Straits to the 27th Brigade's position. This time, the Japanese were not as lucky, as the 27th Brigade's frontage was a quarter of that held by the 22nd Brigade. Guards troops attacking towards the Kranji village were in the killing ground of the 2nd 26th Battalion. By early morning of the 10th of February, the two battalions of the brigade withdrew to the rear. As a prelude to this move, a large oil supply was to be destroyed. Loss of the demolition explosives forced the defenders to simply open the valves to drain the massive storage tanks. The draining oil caught fire and annihilated the leading wave of Japanese troops. At one point, the Guards sought a decision from General Yamashita to withdraw, but he denied this request. By the 10th of February, brigades had been forced inland. As the Australian brigades withdrew, they exposed flanking brigades, which were also obliged to withdraw if a line was to be maintained. With the Guards Division joining the 5th and 18th Divisions, the situation was becoming grim. By the night of the 12th, 13th of February 1942, British forces consolidated into a smaller 45-kilometre defensive perimeter. By the 13th, the Japanese had repaired the causeway and more tanks pushed across to the island. By the 15th of February, running low on food and ammunition, but particularly water, General Percival surrendered to General Yamashita. The land campaign had lasted over 2 months. The Australian Army's performance on the Malayan mainland was at times impressive. Units of the 8th Division had used their time before the Japanese invasion to train hard and come to grips with difficult terrain. As a consequence, some of the Australian engagements with the Japanese were amongst the most bloody and contested of the campaign, and the Australian casualty list reflects this. By the time of the withdrawal to Singapore, however, the units were depleted. Reinforcement of the units with recently arrived untrained troops that were to bear the brunt of the Japanese assault was a recipe for disaster. Singapore was not the Australian Army's finest moment. In very approximate terms, the Australian Army, Navy and Air Force contributed some 20% of the forces to the defence of Malaya and Singapore. This contribution was by no means dominant, with British airmen and sailors making up most of the Air Forces and Navy. Indian troops provided the majority of the ground combat forces. But it was still a significant contribution, and as a consequence, Australia lost 15,000 troops and many precious aircraft and pilots at a time when it could ill afford to, and without inflicting commensurate costs and losses on the Japanese.